preseason awards and watch lists and preseason All-Americans and preseason All-Conference, these things don't really mean much. They don't mean anything at all. I like to joke that, you made a preseason All-American. Well, that and $3 will get you a cup of coffee. That and $15 will buy you 3 wings at this place I ate lunch at the other day. I didn't get the wings because it was 3 wings for $15. It's ridiculous, but it's not worth a lot. Being a preseason All-American, just like being a preseason, favorite to win the conference or preseason this or preseason, none of these things actually amount to anything. Sometimes they carry over and there's a correlation with the season. Sometimes there's not. But it's better to get that kind of recognition than not have it, right? It's better to have that respect and that notoriety than not have it. And anytime you see that come up, that recognition, the preseason All-American, preseason All-Conference, whatever it might be, it always, it raises the question. Can you meet the expectations? Can you live up to the hype? And for Pitt, there's one guy who's getting the most hype. There's one guy who's getting the most preseason recognition. He's not the only guy getting preseason recognition, but he's the one guy getting the most recognition, and he popped up on the screen at the exact perfect time. Kyle Lewis, Pitt linebacker, All-American last year, ACC first-team selection, all-conference first-team selection. If Pitt hadn't gone down the tubes in the final 5 games of the regular season, who knows, he might have been ACC Defensive Player of the Year. That's besides the point. He had a great season last year, and now he's the guy getting some of this preseason recognition. Yesterday, he was named to the Walter Camp preseason All-America first team, one of 4 ACC players to make the the Walter Camp preseason All-America first team. Walter Camp, of course, is one of those major selectors who gets recognized. If you can win that one, that's counted as a legit big-time first team All-America honor after the season. And so for that organization to have you on the watch list and the preseason All-America list is a pretty good thing. But can Kyle Lewis live up to the hype? He's coming into this season as probably, outside of family members, there probably isn't much debate that he's widely recognized as Pitt's best overall player. Heading into this season, he's the one who's getting the most recognition and name notoriety across the country, and rightfully so after the season he had last year. Can he live up to it? What does he need to do this year to live up to the hype? What does 2025 need to look like for Kyle Lewis after the monster season that he had last year? Can Kyle Lewis live up to the hype in 2025? That's our topic here today on the Morning Pit. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's the Wednesday edition of the Morning Pit here on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Pete from Panther-Lair.com. You see the website below, Panther-Lair.com. It's Pitt site on the 24/7 Sports Network, where we cover all things Pitt for you: Pitt football, Pitt basketball, Pitt recruiting, Pitt transfer portal, Pitt everything. Panther-Lair.com. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. And if you're looking to hang out with other Pitt fans, there's no better place to do it than the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. They are humming along, Pitt fans talking about everything going on in Pitt football, Pitt recruiting, Pitt basketball. I've had some lively conversations there over the last few days, the last few weeks, the last few months about where that team's three-point shooting is going to come from. We've got a lot of different opinions out there, but it's good conversation nonetheless. So if you want to hang out with other Pitt fans, I think it's the best online community of Pitt sports fans you are going to find. Panther-Lair.com. And of course, our YouTube channel here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, where you get all of our Pitt video content. Monday through Friday, we have one of these Morning Pitt videos, something for you to think about and talk about throughout the day, a little bit of Pitt sports talk to get your day started. We have our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m., so we'll be live tonight, me and Jim Hammett and you talking about Pitt sports. We have post-game shows and interviews and press conferences and all kinds of video content for you right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you like this video and subscribe, and then you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So Kyle Lewis was pretty awesome last year. And, is this a bit of a victory lap for me because I hyped him up after so many hype trains went off the rails? Obviously, Bengali Kamara and Amsal Delilich are on the Mount Rushmore of guys I hyped up who didn't pan out. Michael Smith, that wide receiver from a few years ago. Remember him? I hyped him up pretty good. Nothing ever came of that. And then who else? Bub Means. I was on the Bub Means hype train, but I think that was like legitimate. I think that one more or less panned out because how he played in the final like 8 games of that 2023 season, he was on pace. He played like 1,000-yard receiver over those final 8 games. So I'm gonna take credit for that one. I'm sure there have been other guys along the way. Maybe that'll be a question one day. Who's on my Mount Rushmore of overhyped guys? Certainly Amsal Delilich and Bengali Kamara. They're co-vice presidents. You know what I mean? They're at the top of the list. They are both senior associate executive vice presidents of the hype train off the rails brigade. But last year, I think I hyped up Kyle Lewis, and I don't know if I went quite so far as I did with some of those other guys, but I hyped up Kyle Lewis, and that one panned out. 101 tackles, 101 tackles, 15.5 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks, and 4 interceptions, plus another interception on a 2-point conversion that doesn't actually count as an interception, but a pass was thrown by the opposing team, and he caught it. He also blocked an extra point attempt against Toledo and returned that for 2 points. So multiple scores, multiple big plays, one of the best overall stat lines by a Pitt defender probably in school history. It's been a long time. Prior to last season, it had been a long time since a Pitt linebacker recorded 100 tackles in a season. You know how long? All the way back to Max Gruder in the 2011 season. He had 100 and some odd tackles, 100-plus tackles in that Todd Graham year. 116, actually, in Todd Graham's season, but he only had 8.5 tackles for loss. Kyle Lewis had 7.5. Max Gruder also only had 0.5 sacks, whereas Kyle Lewis had 7.5, and Max Gruder had no interceptions. Kyle Lewis had 4. If you really want to look for a comparison in Pitt history of what Kyle Lewis did last year or kind of how it stacks up, you got to go back to Scott McKillop in 2008. 137 tackles, 17.5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, 2 interceptions. That's probably, or at least it was until this past season, that's probably the best performance by a Pitt linebacker in school history. Like an inside linebacker, not like, Hugh Green was a linebacker or Ricky Jackson was a linebacker. I mean, those guys were defensive ends, effectively. We're talking about either an inside linebacker in a 4-3 or an outside linebacker the way that Pitt plays them now with Kyle Lewis and those guys. And so you really go back to Scott McKillop for the last big-time performance, stat-stuffing performance by a Pitt linebacker in 2008. And so you're on sort of, you're in rarefied air there, or whatever that phrase is, rarefied territory or something like that. You're an elite company. When you're talking about Scott McKillop in 2008, I mean, that was an All-American performance, an All-Big East performance. He was great. And Kyle Lewis, arguably, I mean, some of his stats were even better. 101 tackles, whereas McKillop had 137. McKillop got the edge on tackles for loss. He had 2 more than Kyle Lewis did. McKillop had 4 sacks. Kyle Lewis had 7.5. And McKillop had 2 interceptions. Lewis had 4, plus that other one on the 2-point conversion that doesn't count. So arguably, Kyle Lewis had the better or more complete or more stuffed stat line. So you really, legitimately could make a case for Kyle Lewis having the best stat line, the best box score of any Pitt defensive player in school history. In terms of doing kind of everything. I mean, there have been players who have had more tackles. There have been players who had more tackles for loss, players who had more sacks, players who had more interceptions. But to get across the board production like that is pretty rare and pretty unique. And I don't think you find a lot of stat lines that equal that. And as a matter of fact, if you look in college football last year, there really aren't many guys who could equal or match what Lewis did. As far as I could tell, there were only 3 FBS linebackers last season who had at least 100 tackles, at least 15 tackles for loss, at least 3 sacks, and at least 4 interceptions. And that was Sean Dolak from Buffalo, Jackson Woodard from UNLV, and Kyle Lewis. Now, both, Dolak is probably the gold standard for linebackers last season. He had 168 tackles, 18.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, and 5 interceptions. So, I mean, he's got more tackles than Lewis, more tackles for loss than Kyle Lewis. He's behind Lewis by 1 sack, but he also had 5 interceptions, which, again, as we know with Lewis, like we say, he had 4, but he really had 5, even if they don't all count. Jackson Woodard, I kind of included him here because he had 135 tackles, 17 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, 4 interceptions. Pretty big dip there on the sacks, but he matches Lewis on the picks. He has more tackles for loss, more tackles. Though that's really it. And both of those guys, I miss UNLV and Buffalo. So if you want to narrow it down to power conferences, nobody else in the power conferences had a stat line that matches what Kyle Lewis did. Now, somehow he was not a consensus All-American. The other, Dolak, the kid from Buffalo, was a consensus All-American, understandably. The other 2 consensus All-American linebackers were Jay Higgins at Iowa and Danny Stutzman from Oklahoma. And their numbers are nowhere near what Lewis did, let alone Jackson Woodard, the kid from UNLV. But, whatever. I'm sure they did lots of things that don't show up on the stat sheet, right? Anyway, I digress. My point, whether you want to haggle about should he have been an All-American, this or that, you know what? Just as a quick aside, if you want Kyle Lewis to have been a consensus All-American last year, just like ACC Defensive Player of the Year, Pitt needed to win a couple of those games down the stretch. If Pitt goes 8-4, maybe not 8-4, but if they go at least 9-3 or 10-2 in the regular season, I think Kyle Lewis is a consensus All-American and ACC Defensive Player of the Year. But they lost out, and Kyle Lewis paid the price. This is part of it, right? Like, you don't usually get high honors when teams aren't very good. And Pitt finished the season 7-5 with a 5-game losing streak, just looking at the regular season. And so, individual recognition takes a hit when the team struggles like that. Nevertheless, the point remains. Kyle Lewis was one of the most productive players, defensive players in college football last year. And you could make a case that he was the most productive defensive player in a Power 4 conference last year. All of this leads into the preseason recognition that he's getting, where he's, I think Phil Steele put him on his preseason All-ACC list. Obviously Walter Camp, like we're talking about, preseason All-American first team. I think College Football Network or somebody had him, inside the top 50 in returning players in college football. Kyle Lewis is getting the respect and the recognition and the love in the preseason. Now we come to our question. Will he live up to it? I mean, as someone who was on the Kyle Lewis hype train last year, I will say yes. You can count me as a believer here. I think the things that Kyle Lewis did last year, because I think what you have to understand about Kyle Lewis, okay? Athleticism, check. Speed, check. He had all those things in high school. The ability to run sideline to sideline, the ability to chase down ball carriers, the ability to drop into coverage. And he was, according to Pro Football Focus, he was the top graded linebacker in coverage in the ACC last year. He was the top graded linebacker overall in the ACC last year, at least among guys with at least 400 snaps. And I know we all take Pro Football Focus's grades with a grain of salt, and understandably, I do too. I use it for snap counts, I use it for targets, I use it for pressures. The grades are far more subjective, and so we're not going to make too big a deal out of that. But it is interesting to note that Kyle Lewis was the highest graded linebacker in the ACC last year, and number 2, Rasheem Biles. That's another topic for another day. But Lewis had those physical traits when he came out of high school. I mean, he was a sideline-to-sideline monster in high school and made tons of plays. I mean, that's why Pitt was so attracted to him coming out of high school. But the physical skills alone don't get you to the level of success that Kyle Lewis had last year, because he also was remarkably smart on the field, knew the defense well, had the football IQ, had the instincts, and was able. That's how you make those plays. Like, you don't put up that kind of stat line without having at least some sense of how to play the game and understanding the game at a more advanced level. And this is the thing with Kyle Lewis, is I don't think you can really scheme around him. I don't think you can scheme him out of plays. You can't take him out of the defense, not without sacrificing a considerable amount at some other spot on your offense. Because he's too instinctive, he's too smart. And when you put that knowledge element with the athleticism element, you put the knowledge with the physical skills that he has, it makes him an absolute weapon. And to the point where, you think about him and how his skills will translate in the NFL. I mean, he's got the speed to play at the next level. He's not big, but with his knowledge and his athleticism, when you put those two elements together, you get a guy who can play at the next level. You get a guy who can excel at the next level, even if he is undersized. And I think that's the key with Kyle Lewis, is his size is not an impediment. He's not out there getting run over. He's plenty strong enough. He's plenty physical enough. And he's smart enough that he understands angles. He understands leverage. He understands the play calls. He does a lot of film work. He sets the example for everyone else in the linebacker room and the defense of the work you have to put in to excel on Saturdays. What you have to do Sunday to Friday in order to do well on Saturdays. He's the first one in the film room. He's the first one in the weight room. He's the guy leading that linebacker room, and he's the guy leading that defense, and it comes through in the production because now he can really back it up. Like if he wanted to go to somebody last year and say, hey, you need to be doing this, you need to work harder, you need to do that, okay, probably. You'll get some people to listen. But now you're a returning All-American. You had 100 tackles. First time a Pitt linebacker has done that in 13 years. And you're the guy getting talked about as one of the best defensive players in the ACC and one of the best linebackers in the country. Now you've got a little bit you've got credentials. And you can walk up to younger guys on the team and say, why aren't you in the film room right now? Why'd you miss the lift this morning? And they have to respect you. And you can emerge as one of the team leaders. And so, I think that's what Kyle Lewis is going to bring. And so I think when you put together how he plays and how he approaches the game, I don't see any reason he should fall off. Maybe the interceptions. If that might be the one thing teams could do is just not throw in his direction. And they're going to know where he is at all times. He lined up on the line of scrimmage more than any linebacker in the ACC last year, or a higher percentage of snaps. I mean, he was lining up and rushing off the edge a lot. He blitzed quite a bit. And so they're going to know he's coming. They're going to be watching where he is. They always call out the mic. They're going to call out the mic, and they're also going to know where number 9 is. But I don't think it's going to matter. I think he'll have another 100 tackle season. I think he'll have double-digit tackles for loss again. I think he'll be between 5 and 10 sacks again. And the interceptions will just be a product of opportunity. But the thing about Kyle Lewis is when the opportunity presents itself, he'll be there to take advantage of it. Right? Opportunity is what happens when knowledge meets preparation. He's going to have all of those things in place. So when the opportunity presents itself, he's ready to take advantage. I'm buying in on Kyle Lewis this year. It's not a hot take. That's not exactly going out on a limb saying I'm buying in on the guy who had 100 tackles last year. Is all conference first team selection and All American. Not really going out on a limb buying in on it. But there is a question of can you do it again? Can you what do you do for an encore? What is your second season? This is what your first season looked like. You did a great job. What's your second season look like? Well, I'm buying in on Kyle Lewis's second season. Be just as good, if not better, than his first. And it just might happen. The other guy, the other end of the linebackers, the other outside linebacker, might have a really good season too. We'll talk about him another time. But for today, it's all about the Kyle Lewis hype, a preseason first-team All-American, according to the Walter Camp Foundation, and projected to be one of the best defensive players in the ACC in 2025. I think it's going to happen. What do you think? You buying in on Kyle Lewis? You think he can repeat what he did last year and maybe even do it better? I am. What about you? Leave your comments on Panther-Lair.com or here on the video at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. And thanks so much for tuning in today. Hope you've had a great week so far. Hope your Wednesday goes well. Don't forget we have the live show tonight at 8:30 p.m. If you subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, you can turn on notifications. You'll get an alert when we go live so you never forget that we have our live show every Wednesday night at 8:30. So tune in tonight for that. Look forward to your comments and questions in the sort of call-in format that we have, where we use a chat screen instead of a phone call. But we look forward to interacting with you tonight. So come check it out, 8:30 p.m. right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And then we'll be back for another Morning Pit tomorrow morning right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.